Hello, everyone. My name is Jared Holt. I'm a research fellow here at the DFRLab. It's my pleasure to welcome you, virtually at least, to our conversation, Domestic Violent Extremism in the 2020 Election. This event is part of the Atlantic Council's Election 2020 series, which features conversations on the most critical issues at the intersection of domestic and international affairs that will influence this year's US elections. This is a bipartisan series spotlighting foreign policy and national security. It's crucial to drawing attention to often overlooked topics in the run-up to the US elections in November. This event is co-hosted by the Council's Digital Forensic Research Lab, or DFR Lab, and Georgetown Law's Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection, or better known as ICAP. The DFR Lab exists at the intersection of government, media, and technology and works to ensure accountability and transparency online and around the world. The team promotes objective fact as a foundation of government for and by people and protects democratic institutions and norms from those who would undermine them online. DFR Lab has been a leader in the community committed to building resilience against the unique but sometimes related vulnerabilities of disinformation and foreign interference, especially around elections. The mission of the Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection is to use the power of the courts to defend American constitutional rights and values. The Institute, based at Georgetown University Law Center, draws on expert litigators in the constitutional scholarship of Georgetown to vindicate individuals' rights and protect America's constitutional way of life. Today, we'll hear from experts who will contextualize the threat of domestic extremism, how these groups use the internet to grow their ranks, and the effects they may have on the 2020 election. So, with all that out of the way, I'd like to introduce my esteemed guests, or rather have them introduce themselves. I'll start with Mary McCord, Legal Director at Georgetown Law.
Thanks, Jared, and thanks to the Atlantic Council, DFR Labs for hosting this event. It's really important at this particular time. So as Jared indicated, I'm with ICAP. I'm the legal director there. My background, though, before helping to launch this ICAP as a constitutional impact litigation shop within the Georgetown Law School, my background before that was in US government, Department of Justice, public safety, national security, law enforcement. I was a 20-year federal prosecutor in DC. And then the last 3 years of my DOJ career were in the National Security Division, first as the Principal Deputy Assistant Attorney General, and later as the Acting Assistant Attorney General for National Security. So that work put me in very much in the front lines of our counterterrorism program in the US, along with law enforcement partners, intelligence community partners. And since leaving the government, I've continued to work in the national security space, even through ICAP, particularly focused on domestic extremism, political violence, and unlawful militia activities. We are now at a time where these things are all sort of coming together. And we made a bit of an expertise for ourselves really shortly after ICAP launched in 2017, when at the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia, we saw white supremacist organizations and self-proclaimed militia organizations openly carrying, assault rifles, dressed in full military gear, extra magazines, communicating and coordinating in protection of the white supremacists and usurping the functions of law enforcement, making the situation very dangerous and on the street, and which led, as you all know, to not only online street or on-street battles, but also to the death of Heather Heyer and serious injury to many others when a domestic terrorist ran his car into a group of counter-protesters. In the wake of that event, my organization at ICAP was responding to a lot of commentators who were suggesting that there was little that could be done about that type of organized, coordinated use of force by private actors, suggesting that, well, they had First Amendment rights to be there and they had Second Amendment rights to bear arms. But of course, what we thought as lawyers was the First Amendment doesn't protect violence. It doesn't protect incitement to violence or imminent lawful activity. And the Second Amendment protects an individual right to bear arms, but not organized, coordinated paramilitary activity. So we brought a lawsuit on behalf of the city of Charlottesville, local businesses, local residents, to get a court orders that would prevent that type of activity in the future. As you may recall, the organizers of the Unite the Right rally, even before the day was done, were already saying that they were going to come back again and again to Charlottesville because their complaint was that their civil rights had been violated because they weren't able to fully hold their protest. It got shut down as an unlawful assembly before they were finished. That case was successful. It did result in court orders against 23 different individuals and organizations, barring them from returning to Charlottesville, engaging in paramilitary activity, which we defined as 2 or more persons acting together in concert while armed with a firearm or anything whose purpose was for use as a weapon during any protest, demonstration, rally, or march. In the years since then, we've consulted with local jurisdictions throughout the country, oftentimes to help them prepare for how they can protect public safety at demonstrations and rallies without treading upon First and Second Amendment rights. And as a result of that work, we launched this summer a toolkit, a legal toolkit called Protests and Public Safety, a guide to cities and citizens, which can be found at constitutionalprotestguide.org. About the same time we launched that, we were seeing dramatic increase in demonstrations across the country for racial justice in the wake of the killing of George Floyd. And as a result of that, we were seeing more and more of these private unlawful militias self-deploying to the streets, ostensibly to protect private property, protect even public property, sometimes including statues, against what were often really trumped up or false rumors about violent anarchists coming to riot and loot. So in a response to that, we have been concerned that some of these same groups might deploy to the election, deploy to polling places, ostensibly to protect against voter fraud, and have also heard more and more of the chatter over social media and elsewhere about these groups training and preparing themselves for the post-election period in which they are expecting political violence. So I want to make 3 quick points before we move on, and I'm sorry about taking so much time. But when it comes to unlawful militia activities, 3 points to remember, and we can get into these further as we go along. First, there is no lawful authority under federal or state law for private groups of individuals to arm themselves, organize, and call themselves forth as a militia. The only lawful militia is a state militia. Second, Second Amendment doesn't protect that. It protects an individual right to bear arms, but the Supreme Court has been very clear. It does not protect paramilitary organizations. They said that in 1886. They said that again in 2008. And third, all 50 states prohibit paramilitary organizations through a combination of their constitutional provisions and their state statutes.
So moving on, I'd like to introduce J.M. Berger, or rather, I'll have him introduce himself. J.M.
Hi, and thanks for having me. I appreciate it. It's good to be here. Important topic. My name is J.M. Berger. I am a PhD candidate at Swansea School of Law and a researcher with VoxPol, the European Union online extremism think tank. I have been doing this for some years. I sort of came up looking, sort of splitting my time researching jihadist extremism and right-wing extremism. Nobody cared about the second one until very recently, unfortunately. But I'm glad that we're able to talk about it now, if I'm not glad about the reason. I've written a couple of books on jihadism and a book on extremism, which is called Extremism, and it is a sort of framework for talking about how we evaluate different kinds of groups, which I think is a topic that is pretty relevant to some of what we're going to be getting into here. And my most recent book is called Optimal, and it's my first stab at writing a novel, and it's about some of the bad things that social media does to us, and that is also pretty relevant to what we're going to be talking about here. So where I am at in looking at the situation running up to the election is that we're really in many ways experiencing kind of a perfect storm. So we have an environment that has sort of multiple threat elements to it that are really problematic. And the first and probably the most important is something that I wrote about recently for The Atlantic, is that there's just tremendous uncertainty in this country right now, and this uncertainty is happening at multiple levels. And it was already going on, but really the COVID pandemic has driven it into overdrive. So you have a pandemic that the parameters of which, I think, for if you're not a medical expert, and maybe even if you are extremely unclear. So we've gone through, multiple iterations of what are you supposed to do to take care of yourself? What are we supposed to do just to respond to this on a societal level? And there's still not a real clear consensus on some of these things. The pandemic then caused an economic crisis, which is causing tremendous uncertainty for even more people. So people are worried about their jobs. They're worried about how to keep their kids safe. Can I go out to dinner? Can I take a walk? Can I go to the beach? All these questions are require you to sort of like go out and evaluate a lot of different claims in order to figure out what's going on. And then the third big factor promoting uncertainty is sort of the rise of social media. So in social media has created a really strange environment for society, because generally speaking, and this is something that I talk about in more detail in my Atlantic article, we establish what's real by looking at consensus. You cannot individually go out and ascertain every fact that is relevant to your life. You can't figure out, how electricity works. You can't figure out, how the food chain works. You have to rely on other people to tell you. So when other people have conflicting opinions, we look for a consensus of opinion to sort of tell us what's right. And this has always been somewhat fraught. It's always been a source of uncertainty. It's been a source of extremism, because when you don't know what to believe, you turn to the people you're closest to. And that often means turning to the people who are most like you in some way, whether it's in your religion or your race or your, whatever values you have, your nation. You turn to the consensus that you think represents you the best. And social media has just thrown a bomb into the process of consensus making, because it provides an instant feedback loop that any opinion can immediately be evaluated based on how much people agree with it. So people retweet it, they like it, they share it, they comment on it. You have this sudden arrival of essentially a machine that does nothing but measure consensus. And because all of these overlapping social networks are in competition with each other, the measurement of consensus is chaotic. So for some people, if you find 50 people who agree with your tweet that, the earth is flat, then that's enough people who agree with you to make you think that something's real. We laugh at somebody who thinks the earth is flat, and we might question their sanity, but they're really, if they're hearing that from their peers, they're responding to a very basic kind of human construct of how to understand the world. So it's not as simple as just being wrong or dumb or crazy. And so if you take that to the next level, if you believe that a secret cabal of pedophiles is running the world and that Donald Trump is fighting a secret war to overturn them, you can find thousands of people who will agree with that. You will find a consensus of thousands or hundreds of thousands or even millions who will give that some kind of credence. And so all of these competing consensuses just increase the need for us to use a selection process by which we identify the people who are closest to us. We identify the people who are most like us, and we embrace the same set of facts that they embrace. And all of these things are coming together at the time of a presidential election, which is now newly arrived fourth source of uncertainty, because everything about the election is up in the air. How do you vote? Is it safe to vote? Will the vote be legitimate? You have one side that's screaming about voter fraud while at the same time dismantling the actual apparatus of the election. So we're set up for a situation that is just tremendously chaotic, full of uncertainty. And in this environment, what we've seen is that a number of competing extremist movements have risen up, many of whom are likely to be triggered or activated by the election. and its outcome. So I think that we're in for some rough roads ahead. I think that regardless of who wins the election, we are going to see manifestations of extremism popping up everywhere at a level that our society is not comfortable with. Um, and I think it's going to be very difficult. I think who wins the election will dictate the kind of activity we see, but I think we're going to see that activity either way. And it's a difficult road ahead. And you know, I guess the only consolation I can sort of offer on this is that, you know, if you work in this field long enough, you do tend to expect the worst, and often the worst doesn't happen. Often these things do fizzle out. I don't think that's going to happen this time. I mean, but I have been wrong in the past. I have expected more in the past. I think the trajectory of the last 4 years has been pretty difficult. Um, I will be very glad to be wrong if that turns out to be the case. But I think I'm sadly I don't think I'm going to be. So
So, JM, you said, and I agree, we are living in a time that is frankly very confusing, but I'm hoping this conversation today can maybe impart with our audience a little bit more clarity or uh, hopefully not too much more alarm. Uh, before we start diving into these questions, we've got a lot of ground to cover. I want to know that uh, on this panel, we're going to have a discussion with Mary and JM, and then we're going to open up the conversation to questions from the audience. If you're joining us on Zoom and have questions, you can use the Q&A function, and you can also engage in the conversation using the hashtag online AC Elections 2020. And with that, like I said, we've got a lot of ground to cover, but I'll take this one to Mary first. What steps are domestic violent extremists taking in the lead up to the 2020 election to improve their online coordination and their general recruitment efforts? What can you tell us about that?
Well, I mean, you guys do more of the research work on social media than I do. I bring the lawyer perspective to it. But what I can say is that, as has already been previewed, they are definitely using social media to recruit. They are using the fact that there's been so much more attention put on them by journalists and others. I mean, today alone, I've spoken to multiple journalists who spent some time embedded with or interviewing members of unlawful militia groups and extremist groups, and they thrive on that kind of popularity. They love being interviewed. They love getting their voice out there in mainstream media as an augmentation to what they do on their own on social media. I think if we look sort of historically, at least what I've seen from a lawyer's perspective, including during my time at the Department of Justice, is that just like foreign terrorist organizations, just like ISIS, extremist organizations here in the US have been able, and as JM so aptly described, really spread and propagate their propaganda widely and deeply with a minimal amount of effort. Now, in the lead up to the 2020 election, of course, we've also had actions taken by Facebook and Twitter and some other sort of the bigger mainstream platforms to deplatform some extremist groups, including QAnon, and certainly including at least militias that they become aware of as being unlawful militias. This in some way, this has been good, I think, because those platforms are still the platforms that are the easiest for just general Americans to access. There's almost no barrier to entry, and therefore those are more effective for their recruiting and for their propagation of material than other platforms. But it doesn't mean they don't have ways to communicate. And so they've certainly gone to more less popular platforms. And I don't even know very much about these platforms. You guys can discuss them better than I, but Parler and 8chan and 4chan and subreddits and things like that, which and then they've been deploying operational security in ways similar to what I remember when I was sitting, at the Department of Justice as the acting assistant attorney general, the same type of operational security that ISIS used. So They're using encrypted communications, direct communications. They're creating closed forums that only those who have been vetted and are allowed in are able to communicate in. And they are, otherwise creating, smaller, more exclusive groups that are not openly publicly available. Now that means less accessible for recruitment, but it means more in the dark from the rest of us who might be wanting to pay attention to what they're doing so we can prepare for it. When I was in the government, we called this going dark, meaning it was just more and more difficult to get the intelligence needed, either through just open source social media or even using, surveillance, law enforcement and surveillance tools that were available when I was in the government. It was still harder because of the prolific use of encryption. We certainly saw with the recent arrests in Michigan, that organization was very much using these types of operational security, both in their online discussions, but also even in their physical gatherings, even, making people leave their cell phones upstairs and using a trap door to go do planning in a basement of someone's home or building. So that does make it more, again, that's not particularly good for their recruiting, but it's definitely good for their planning efforts. And what we are hearing though is, some efforts, although I think that there's some disagreement among many of these organizations about how extensive these efforts should be, but some efforts to deploy small groups of armed individuals and others out to polling places. And there are certainly also efforts to just encourage their members to apply to be official election observers who are actually allowed into the polling places to just muck up the works, just bring frivolous challenges and other complaints about the process that will make it more difficult for election officials to actually do their jobs, provide a safe and accessible voting experience, and be able to actually count and tabulate the ballots in a timely manner in order to get credible election results out. And then we're seeing more and more planning, even in the publicly available social media, about what JM was talking about, potential for political violence post-election, with some organizations engaging in a lot of hyperbole, I hope it's hyperbole, about civil war. So social media is still, despite the fact that some of these platforms have taken things down, it still, I think, is the most useful form of planning and communication that these organizations have. And we know it's useful too, because they're not having to do things just at a localized level. And this is also very much the same with what we saw with what we've seen in foreign terrorist organizations. They're able to be cross-border, cross states, travel and plan and cross state lines. And we're seeing this on a much bigger scale than I have seen in the past with respect to these type of organizations.
Yeah, Mary. So to what you were saying about these groups kind of reacting to different moderation efforts being taken by platforms like Facebook and Twitter, that's something that we've been keeping an eye on at DFRLab. Is looking at how these groups use the internet, and especially right now how that's changing as they're sort of decentralizing off of these standard watering holes, if you will, on the internet, the major social media platforms. But from at least what I've been observing, even when they're moving to these new platforms, if they're introducing a new level of, as you said, going dark, trying to close the group, once they are in these groups, they're still operating in a lot of the same old ways. And that's where I want to take it to you, JM, is, can you kind of run us through how do extremist organizations utilize the internet? Like, what are some of the general tactics, and as they're kind of bouncing from platform to platform, how might that change? Is there any historical precedent there?
Well, there's not a historical precedent for the kind of moderation wars we're seeing now. This is really something that's kind of new because we haven't had these kinds of platforms in the past. Uh, in the past, it was very expensive to do any kind of media operation that would reach more than a couple hundred people at a time. So, you couldn't get a network TV slot, you couldn't get an audience of millions. So what I worry about in this context is that we are seeing these social media companies are starting to crack down now, but they're late to the game. And what's happened is, your earlier question was about recruitment. Recruitment was pretty much wrapping up. They did their recruitment, and then they get kicked off these platforms right as this election is coming up, and they're starting to think about mobilization. And the platforms that they're moving to are good for mobilization. So if you're going to a private chat, an encrypted chat, any kind of secure or pseudo secure in a lot of these cases, platform that's going to let you organize, I think you're you have a kind of a bad confluence here of not being able to do your work out in the open and having a desire to go dark and do this work that's going to be more connected to operational stuff anyway. Another element I think that has to be considered on this is that because a lot of this recruitment has already taken place, what we see is the companies crack down when they get bad headlines, and they get bad headlines when a bunch of these guys show up in a public place and do something bad. The problem is once they all show up in a public place together, now they know each other for real. Like there's still some value to a face-to-face connection, and they have each, they're trading phone numbers, and they're making connections that will be durable past the online network. So if you hit this network before it starts gathering in the real world, you have a good chance of sort of stopping it from reaching critical mass. And what I think now is that you have pretty large groups of people who have actually had real world interactions. And so they will pursue their connections and relationships in a variety of formats, even if you're pushing back. And I'll say also just briefly, the companies are have various levels of effort on this. All of them are decidedly imperfect. Some of them are more purely cynical than others, probably, I guess is how you could characterize it. But they're all headline driven. They're all PR related kind of efforts. That doesn't mean that there aren't really good people working on this problem in each of the companies. I mean, they have brought in people who really know these subjects and who care about it passionately. But ultimately, I think a lot of the problems we have with this sort of swelling of extremist groups and then desperate efforts to kind of put the genie back in the bottle is that the top leadership of the companies don't really understand or care about this issue. And I think that's particularly, I think it's problematic for all three of the big providers of social platforms, so Google, Facebook, and Twitter. With Twitter and Facebook, I think you have companies that are really cults of personality in a lot of ways. And so the failure of their top leadership to grasp this is really problematic. Whereas I think, and I may be wrong about this, but I sort of see Google as having more of a traditional corporate structure that is ultimately more responsive to what people want and what civic obligations people are going to place on them. Whereas I think with Twitter and Facebook, I think you have CEOs who sort of see this as their personal responsibility to safeguard something or not safeguard something, and that their personal views profoundly influence what happens in a way that is less than ideal.
So, switching gears a little bit, Mary, I want to go back to something you touched on briefly earlier, which is that a lot of these extremist groups have really ramped up activity this summer, largely around some of the civil unrest that we saw in American cities after the police killing of George Floyd. Can you talk a little bit more about how that social tension was exploited and capitalized on by extremists and what ICAP has been seeing and hearing related to that?
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. And I want to back up a little bit further even than this summer, because, really beginning the summer of 2017, even in 2016, I think we were seeing more and more sort of open displays of extremism in the US, white supremacist extremism in particular, supported by open bearing of arms by organized paramilitary organizations. And obviously this, was very much on display at the Unite the Right rally, and that was followed by several years worth of, well, the last few years worth of White Lives Matter rallies, other types of rallies with similar names that were very open about their extremist views in ways that I think were surprising. We've seen that in our history with the KKK and things like that, but this was a lot of people espousing these extremist views. And then at the same time, we've seen something of a call and response between the president and members of some of these extremist groups. So for example, if you go back to the fall of 2018, when there were the president was tweeting about a migrant invasion at the southwest border. He was calling on troops to send troops to the border to supplement Customs and Border Patrol. Some of these extremist militia groups saw that as their license to activate and deploy themselves to the southwest border. And in fact, groups did that. The United Constitutional Patriots actually set up a camp right at the border of New Mexico and Mexico, right where it meets Texas. They then went on to actually detain migrants crossing the and hold them until they could be turned over to Customs and Border Patrol. And this went on for some time until it was exposed through videos that went viral, videos that were posted by the organization themselves because they're proud of what they're doing and they want to publicize it and they wanted to use it for recruitment. Now, I am happy to say that one of their members was ultimately arrested, charged with falsely assuming the duties of a federal official, and was just sentenced to 21 months just last week in prison. Because that's unlawful. And we've seen it in other instances as well. We certainly saw this early this year when the pandemic started, but even before George Floyd had been killed, we saw with the various governors around the country imposing shutdown orders and stay-at-home orders in response to the pandemic. We saw calls from the White House to liberate some of these states, liberate Michigan, liberate Minnesota, liberate Virginia, and protect your Second Amendment rights. And again, these are like dog whistles to these extremist organizations. And what we saw was armed paramilitary groups literally storming the state house in places like Michigan and Ohio. And we've also seen it in Idaho and elsewhere in opposition to what they saw as the tyranny of the governor. So armed opposition in the state house. And this, in really very much in direct response from things they were hearing out of the leadership of this country. So when you get to the point of George Floyd's death in May, and the spontaneous racial justice demonstrations around the country, and I want to footnote here, by and large peaceful. Like, we all think they're violent because we see over and over and over again videos of acts of violence, but there are thousands and thousands of demonstrations around the country that have been completely peaceful. But at any rate, in response to those acts of violence, and we know from valid fact-based reporting that violence has been undertaken by people on both sides of the political ideology. I would say more of it's spurred by the far right than the far left, but I acknowledge that extremism, whether it's right or left, extremist violence is wrong, and there are definitely people with both extremist ideologies that have been involved in some of those acts of violence. But what was coming out of that the White House at the time really was putting its thumb on the scale of just one side of this and blaming all of the acts of violence on the left, on Antifa, going so far as to say Antifa would be designated as a domestic terrorist organization, which, by the way, our laws don't permit. We don't have a structure for doing that, and it would raise serious First Amendment concerns. Launching investigations, but in the same time of launching the investigations, already branding the left as domestic terrorists. spreading disinformation about violent anarchists coming to riot and loot in towns. And again, in that dog whistle form, these extremist groups saw that as their license to self-deploy in defense of property, in defense of their towns against these false rumors about violent anarchists. And so this, in response to that, we started at ICAP getting a lot of, calls and emails and letters from concerned residents and activists and local officials saying, is this legal? I went out with my daughter to do a high school Black Lives Matter march in downtown Sandpoint, Idaho, and there were, dozens of heavily armed men in full military gear standing on the corners saying they were there to protect property. The answer is no, it's not legal. And so we've been trying to really shine a light on that. We've sent letters. When we get these kind of inquiries, we send letters to all of the local officials, including police chiefs, sheriffs, mayors, city council, and we send them to the press. And then the press publishes them. And sometimes we get an immediate call from a local official who wants to talk about it. They weren't aware that these things were not protected by the Constitution. They weren't aware that their own state laws don't allow this type of activity, and they want to talk about what options are available. Sometimes we don't hear from the public official at all, but the local press puts a big story in the paper. They put it on the nightly news, and the community members start raising it at city council meetings. And so these things are important to really get information out there to the public, empower the public, and in the case of the election, empower voters to know that the law doesn't permit this. They don't have to sit idly by. They can report it, and we're busy getting this information out to law enforcement too, who often also labor under the same misunderstanding of the Second Amendment as so many Americans do. And we've done fact sheets about the law for all 50 states. We've done fact sheets about voter intimidation. And just today, we posted on our website guidance for what law enforcement can do when there are armed groups of individuals around polling places. We're going to follow that hopefully tomorrow with what election officials can do, because this is stuff that our election officials and law enforcement haven't had to deal with before in terms of an election. And it could be very intimidating to voters, but we don't want to scare voters away. So we want to empower them with this type of knowledge so that state and local officials will make strong statements against voter intimidation. We're starting to see that from a number of attorneys general, including from both parties. We're seeing it from local district attorneys, even some local police chiefs and sheriffs. And so that's the kind of thing that voters need to know, that their rights will be protected, their vote will be counted, the election is legitimate, and they should feel empowered to go out and assert their constitutional right to vote.
I can just build on something that Mary said. This bullhorn effect from the top is a real problem in the current environment, because what we have are a large collection of groups that are either disparate or they overlap in part, but they don't overlap completely. So your concern in this environment, there's kind of three ways that this can go. They can be competing with each other, against each other, which is in some ways better for society at large, although it's often leads to violence, so it's not great. More of a concern in this environment with what's coming from the White House is that they can either be synchronized or coordinated. So if they're synchronized, what it means is that they're all responding to the same cues. And I think we're there. They are all responding to the same broad cues that they're getting from the White House and from the right-wing media complex. And so they're more likely to act at the same time, and they're more likely to create chaos at the same time, which is particularly worrisome in the run-up to the election. What we really need to be looking at and concerned about going forward is if they start coordinating. And that's when they're actively trying to be strategic and trying to do things that advance the same goals in the same way. Fill in the gaps where one has coverage and one doesn't. I don't think we're there yet, but that is something that I would be deeply concerned about, especially if we end up in a contested election situation and there's a lot of messaging coming from the White House about people needing to stand up and take their government back.
Yeah, so uh, let's zoom out for a little bit, go big picture, and then we can move it over to a Q&A. Something that DFRLab looks a lot at is sort of how this domestic organizing might be exploited or exacerbated by foreign actors. Uh, particularly ones that are interested in furthering, encouraging destabilization in the United States. Uh, JM, does this moment that we're in right now compare to anything that you've seen in your line of work? Is there, or, are you aware of any evidence that this might be the case right now?
I mean, it's tough to make the historical comparison because the social environment is so differently, and it's also tough because the continual narrative that you get from extremist groups is that the end is always near. So, there is certainly a you're constantly struggling when you're looking at this as to sort of filter out the apocalypticism of the people you're reading versus what's actually reasonable and good, and I struggle with that a lot. I think that in the mid 90s, certainly we saw really, a tremendous buildup of tension and anger and organization among these movements that culminated in the Oklahoma City bombing. And what happened after that is that these movements kind of retrenched and retreated because in many ways it felt like that act felt like overreach. And so the question is, first, are we thinking about terrorism or insurrection? And then second, you know, are they going to have a sort of charismatic leader who's pushing them to keep going, even if they starting to wonder if they've gone too far? So it's hard to reach out for the historical comparison here because so many elements in what we're going through right now are really genuinely unprecedented. I mean, it's not no single piece of what's happening now is unprecedented, but all of them happening at the same time might be.
Okay, and I think with that, let's go to some of these audience questions. This one is from Andrew, uh, and I'll open it up to both of you. It's beyond closely coordinated activities, which we've been talking about here, organized groups, paramilitary groups, militias. Uh, do we see these groups cultivating what you might call a leaderless resistance or what's been called stochastic terrorism in the current election setting? So I think what this question is asking is, beyond the coordination, do we see extremist groups trying to inspire maybe lone actors or individuals to take actions related to this election? Either one of you, feel free to speak on that.
Go ahead, JM.
Okay. So it depends on the group. So some groups are very much leadership oriented, like Proud Boys, and some militia movements have leadership at a local level. What you see is like the siege culture type groups are trying to encourage lone actors. The Boogaloo peoples, I think, and incels are more prone to just sort of go off as a one-off because of the nature of their beliefs. But I think I think we need to be worried about these movements are getting their leadership from the television more than that they're going to go into business for themselves.
And I would just add that even if they're not themselves encouraging lone actors, or even if that's not something that, they're out or recruiting for, that doesn't mean you won't have lone actors. I mean, again, if I analogize this to my experience in counterterrorism work in dealing with foreign terrorist organizations, including ISIS, many of the lone actors who committed acts of terrorism here in the US. So think about the Pulse nightclub shooting in Orlando or the San Bernardino mass shootings. Those were done not under the direction and control of ISIS. Those people pledged to ISIS and committed their crime. So they were inspired by ISIS. They were inspired by acts of violence that ISIS was committing, but they weren't or controlled by them. And some of the acts of domestic terrorism that we've seen in the US, like the El Paso shooting, the Poway shooting, the Pittsburgh Tree of Life shooting, those also, at least insofar as what I've seen in open reporting, don't seem to have been sort of connected with any extremist group in the US. Wasn't done on behalf of an extremist group in the US, but I have no doubt that it was motivated by the rhetoric of extremist groups, and in particular, the white supremacist extremist groups. So, whether they're actively seeking lone actors or whether people just are inspired, a phenomenon is that when you have extremist groups who are spreading propaganda, they're spreading disinformation, they are using social media to appear that they are more normalized and mainstream than they really are, then that encourages people to go and take action. And I do think one thing we have to remember, and I know James spoke a little bit about this, when you do this work for a long time, you really prepare for the worst. And coming from a law enforcement background, I think it's generally a good idea to prepare for the worst and hope for the best. But I do think we sometimes do have to step back and realize that as prolific as this does seem right now, it really is still a fraction of the population that espouse these views. And so when I hear these rhetoric about civil war, I mean, the vast majority of Americans do not want us to be in a civil war post-election. They don't want political violence on the streets. They're not interested. I mean, that's not fun for anyone. And no matter your race, ethnicity, anything, it's just not going to be good for anyone. So I think this is one of those times when all of those of us who don't want civil war really need to stand up and say so and really push back against these calls for political violence. I mean, we are not a failed democracy that we see who takes to the streets after our elections. At least we never have been. And I don't think that's what we want to be. And in fact, this ties into your last question, Jared, about foreign influence. That's exactly what Russia wants us to be. That's exactly what China wouldn't mind seeing us being, certainly North Korea and Iran. And there are foreign actors that do have the capability. We just had a major takedown 2 days ago by the Department of Justice, the FBI, against a takedown. They don't take them down. They can't arrest them because the Russian GRU is in Russia and isn't going to be coming here anytime soon. But, returned an indictment that really starts to show you some of the capability of some of the foreign actors. And they don't really care who wins this. They just want to make sure that we're all polarized, we're all in disagreement, and nothing would be better for them than us descending into, more of a failed democracy state.
And something to both of what you, JM, and you, Mary, were saying, something I've brought up with different researchers and reporters through the years is back in the day, kind of to the point of, people seeing this kind of thing online and feeling inspired, even if it's not an explicit call for a lone action or something along those lines, was some numbers put out by Reddit sometime in the mid 2010s about traffic on their forum board. At the time, it was, I guess it still is, but one of the most popular websites on the internet. And they reported something like 90 to 95% of people who were on the site were not actually posting to the site, engaging with the content on the site. They were what they would call lurkers. So, I think it's helpful when we're talking about the extremist content that we're seeing online, these groups interacting online, what we're actually seeing on the page doesn't isn't representative of the amount of eyeballs that is on it or the amount of individuals who might be following along or agreeing with the ideology or radicalizing. So there's kind of a invisible threat there too that comes along with all of this activity online. Um, Going into the next question, Mary, I think you'd be great to start us off on the answer for this. What are the scenarios that you're most worried about when it comes to violence around the election? This is a question from Stan. Are there specific geographic locations, specific organizations, social media platforms, individuals with followings in extremist communities that are kind of top level of concern in violence or fomenting violent action?
Right. So all of the above. I and others have been focusing some of our efforts right now on battleground states where we know there are active paramilitary organizations and extremist organizations, just because those seems like the places where you might have more chance, more likelihood of these organizations showing up at the polls, attempting to intimidate voters, and worse, even showing up after the election, either to try to say we've got to protect, against fraud in the ballot counting, potentially even intimidating the election officials who are responsible for that. And then, of course, taking it upon themselves to protest in the way that they would choose to protest in opposition to the results if they're not happy with the results, or in opposition to others if they are happy with the results, if others are out engaging in peaceful protests. So I think it can go depending, doesn't really matter. I'm with JM on that, who wins. I think we're going to see this type of mobilization. And so obviously looking at places like Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Florida, Arizona, North Carolina, but unlawful paramilitary organizations and extremist organizations, they exist in every state. They are different degrees of organization, and they often they exist. There are national organizations that have chapters, but then there are also just hyper local, like county militias. I mean, in Virginia, where I am, this after the election a year ago, where the Virginia legislature, for the first time in decades, went Democrat at both houses, Democrat with a Democrat in the governor's mansion, the alarmism over the Second Amendment was just incredible in terms of that being a galvanizing force for unlawful paramilitary groups and extremists who take an absolutist view about the Second Amendment, which is not supported by text, history, or Supreme Court precedent. But that galvanized them. They came en masse to the State House in January from all over the country in opposition to what they thought were going to be unreasonable and unlawful gun safety measures taken by the legislature. And so, that I think, and then in further response to that, we've seen across Virginia at the county level, counties mustering their own county militia. When I say counties, I don't mean the government of the county, I mean the citizens of the county mustering their own county militia. In some cases, though, we have actually seen county boards pass resolutions, recognizing these militias. Now, these are places we've sent letters to saying, did you know that militia is unlawful? In the hopes that they will think twice about that. But I say this just to say it exists in a lot of places. And so even though we may focus on certain hotspots related to battleground states or places that have just had such a history, like Idaho, Oregon, Washington, other places in the Pacific Northwest, places that have had such a history of it, we can focus on those, but I don't want anybody to lose focus on the fact that it really could happen in just about any location, particularly where you see sort of what they call sometimes the blue island in the sea of red, right? Where you've got a very rural county, maybe with a town in the middle of it that's more progressive. And so you tend to already have some polarized political views in that area. Tends to be that the people in the rural area are more in favor of expansive gun rights, maybe more supportive of unlawful paramilitary organizations, and the people in the town or the city have the opposite view. And so that's where I think, even if you're not a battleground state, even if it's pretty clear which way your state's going to go, that's a place where I think you could see intimidation at the polls and potential, political violence after the election.
And building on that point, I want to also throw in this question we got from Joseph and take it over to JM. JM, you made the point, and I think, you know, Mary said she agrees. I definitely agree that, the water is hot, right? Things are boiling in this country, and it has the potential to spill over no matter what the election result is. So, uh, JM, can you walk us through a couple different, scenarios that could play out? Of course, this to a degree is crystal ball gazing. So don't, this is a, educated opinion here. But, if Trump wins in a landslide, what might happen? What if Biden does? If it's close, what could we see? Kind of can you walk us through some of the potential possibilities of what might happen?
Yeah. So, I mean, the most immediate concern is election day itself. And, I think one problem with the landscape that we have right now is that if you have 100 different small groups, uh, each of them is going to have its own strategy or thoughts about election day. If 3% or 5% of those groups, let's say it's 100, 3% or 5% of those groups decide to do something dramatic at a polling place, everybody's going to go nuts. That's like 5 terrorist attacks on polling places or 5 armed assaults on polling places. So if we get through election day successfully, then the next question is how long is it going to take to have a clear winner? As we know, there's a lot of muddying of the waters around that. So we could be going for weeks without a clear winner. That's going to be a very dangerous time because people are going to be agitated. They're going to feel like impatient and they're going to feel uncertain, and it's going to create a desire for action in there. I think, as far as who wins and sort of that longer term forecast as you frame the question, a Trump landslide seems unlikely at this point. A Trump technicality win seems like a distinct possibility. You're going to see a lot of activity, I think, on both sides. As we've discussed, as Mary said, and I think anybody watching this probably knows, is most of the violent action we've seen so far has come from the right side of the political spectrum, and they're going to be active no matter what. So depending on what happens, if we have a situation where we have President Trump who's under a cloud of legitimacy, they may take action to try and bolster him, or they may be emboldened to step into the vacuum there. Sort of ironically, this is, take this with a big grain of salt. I'm not advising anybody to bet the rent on this outcome, but I think that my opinion is that if Biden wins, we're more likely to see left-wing extremism, meaning extremism proper. Like we might see violent protests, we might see a lot of anger in the streets, that kind of thing coming from the left if Trump wins. Actual extremist movements that sort of hit the criteria of having a belief that they always have to be in hostile action against an outgroup might be more likely under a Biden administration, because some of the work I've been doing on my dissertation has been looking at the key extremist texts that sort of come up at developmental times in these movements. And what you see is that they devote way more time to talking about the purity of their group than they do about the bad things about the outgroup. So, it's a life cycle kind of issue. When you're in that early stage where these groups are really suddenly mobilizing to become extremists, to become violent, they're often much more concerned with people in their group who are not sufficiently committed to what they think is right. So what you could see is under administration that people aren't happy with change not coming fast enough or being strong enough, and you could see extremist movements kind of boil up in there. I should say, and in the spirit of full disclosure, is that I expected to see more left-wing extremism in the during the Trump administration. I expected there to be more of a increase in that environment, and it hasn't happened. So it may not pan out that way. John Jost, a social psychologist, recently published a really interesting piece about left-wing versus right-wing terrorism and extremist violence, suggesting that it is inherent in the political orientations that the left wing is just going to be less likely to be violent. I don't know how to assess that over the course of history. If you look at the 1970s, certainly you can see a tremendous environment of left-wing violence there, while the right wing was relatively quiescent. So it's, even if that premise is true, that doesn't mean that we're not going to see it. So, yes, the crystal ball is very foggy, I would say. So take all of this with a grain of salt.
All right, and we are running up right on time. This has totally flown by. But last thing, briefly, before I let you both go and we say farewell to our audience, is the $1,000,000 question. And I'll start with you, Mary. What can we do about this?
Well, I've alluded to this in some of my responses because I always think it's so important to make sure there's some hopefulness in what I say, because a lot of it is very doom and gloom. I do think the biggest antidote to voter intimidation is coming out in masses, and we are seeing that. We are seeing that in places with early voting that already are having 4 and 5 hour long lines and even more, and that could be because there's not enough voting locations, because there still are concerted efforts to suppress the vote in many places in the country. But it also, I think, is because there's just so much interest and involvement in actually people exercising their right to vote. And I think that's hugely important. I think it's hugely important for state and local leaders, community leaders, professional athletes, musicians, religious leaders, whoever people, whoever has an audience, to be united right now against political violence in this country, whether it is on the right or on the left. And I'm 100% with Jan, like the vast majority here is from the right. The director of the FBI, Chris Wray, recently testified, and this was no surprise to any of us who pay attention to this, that the biggest terrorism threat in the United States right now is from white supremacists. So we know that's where the threat is, but violence is wrong on both sides. And I think, again, to unite in that message, because we're not going to be able to look to the White House to lead on this, at least unless the president changes his tone dramatically in the next week and a half. I just don't think we're going to hear calls for calm and for peacefulness while we're counting votes. If it happens, then I will be so happy to be wrong about that. So that means everyone else across party lines is really going to have to be strong on this. And, if you use social media, use it for good. Don't spread disinformation. Don't don't retweet things you haven't read carefully. Be very careful where you consume, where you get your news from and consume it. I think we should just have a moratorium on social media for the next week and a half. I think that'd be the best possible thing we could do for our democracy right now, but there might be some constitutional problems with that. So just, vote and denounce violence. That's my mantra.
All right, JM, it's your turn. Save us.
So I think, the strategy depends on who wins. Joe Biden, in some ways, there's certainly a lot of critiques of what he brings that revolve around the fact that he's essentially a pre-Trump status quo candidate. So that may or may not be the best thing for society and politics at large, but it is probably the recipe to calm down the extremist environment. He's not going to do anything dramatic. He's not going to shake things up. Uh, he's going to restore some sense of normalcy and some sense that you can count on the government and you can know what to expect going forward. And so I think some of that will sort of naturally come out of that. I think he's going to have to tread carefully if he wants to really do something programmatic about extremism, because the people who are already agitated are already going to be inclined to mistrust him and resist such a thing. So I think that'll be a long, complicated slog, but it does overall put us on a more hopeful trajectory. So if Trump wins, then everything is on the table at that point, because it is very unclear to me what kind of second term he would run. It is the one thing that I think we can count on is that he will continue to be the chaos president, that there will be uncertainty, that government trust in government will decline, and that various other secondary manifestations of those problems will plague us and really create an environment that's very conducive to extremism. In that instance, it is difficult for everyone else to swim against that tide. But I think, I guess the focus is going to have to be on sort of building alternative social and civic structures that can really present kind of a unified front and kind of a large consensus on where we want to go and who we want to be as a people, that consensus is large enough and strong enough to push back against the really staggering advantage that the holding the office of the presidency offers to someone who is interested in stirring up extremist violence.
And with that, our program today is drawing to a close. I want to extend my sincerest gratitude to Mary McCord and J.M. Berger for joining me today. And I want to also thank participants for submitting their questions. Unfortunately, we only had an hour here. Mary and JM were already so gracious with their time. But if you keep up with JM and Mary and the work we're doing here at DFR Lab, we're staying on top of this. So with that, Mary, JM, thank you so much, and I'll bid you all adieu.
Thank you. Thank you all.